Greetings. We're around we're still Sunday, August 13th, 30 AD. So the subtext is called Cure of Lepers at Tarichea. Jesus instructs his disciples in similitudes. Jesus did not go into the city. Taking a bypath, he drew near the southern wall, not far from the gate. On the exterior side of this wall was a row of huts built purposely for the leprous. As Jesus approached them, he said to the disciples, "Stand at some distance and call out the lepers. Tell them to follow me, and I will cleanse them. When they come out, do ye stand at a distance, that ye may not be alarmed, nor contract stain." It's the verb, nor contract stain. Moreover, do not speak of what ye shall see, for ye remember the fury of the Nazarenes. Ye must not scandalize anyone. Then Jesus went on a little toward the Jordan, while the disciples called to the sick, "Come out and follow the prophet of Nazareth. He will help you." When the disciples saw the poor sufferers coming out of their huts, they hurried away. Jesus, turning out to the road that led to the city, walked slowly toward the region of the Jordan. 5 men of different ages answered the disciples' invitation and issued from the cells in the city wall. They were clothed in white garments, long and wide, but wore no girdle. On their head was a cowl, from which fell over the face a black flap with holes in it for the eyes. They followed Jesus in a single file to a retired spot where he paused. There, the first threw himself at his feet and kissed the hem of his robe. Jesus turned, laid his hand upon the leper's head, prayed over him, blessed him, and bade him step aside. He did in like manner to the second, and so on even to the 5th and last. They now removed their masks, uncovered their hands, and the crust of the leprosy peeled entirely off. Jesus warned them against the sins by which they had brought upon themselves that sickness, told them how they should henceforth conduct themselves, and commanded them not to say anything about this having cured them. But they replied, "Lord, didst thou come so suddenly to us? So long have we hoped for thee, so long sighed for thee, and we had no one to tell thee of our misery, no one to bring thee to us. Lord, thou didst come to us so unexpectedly. How can we restrain our joy? How can we be silent about thy miracle?" Jesus repeated, they must not speak of it until they had fulfilled the law. They should show themselves to the priests, that they might see they were clean, offer the prescribed sacrifices, and perform their prescribed purifications. Then they might proclaim their cure. At these words, the 5 men again fell on their knees, giving thanks, and then went back to their cells. Jesus continued his way to the Jordan, and there rejoined the disciples. These 5 lepers were not closely confined. There was a certain space marked out for them, around which they could go. No one went near them, and it was only from a distance that anyone spoke to them. Their food was deposited in a certain place of platters, or on platters, which were not used a second time. The lepers broke and buried them. That is, the platters. A new dish of little value was given to them with every fresh supply of food. Jesus walked with the disciples some distance toward the Jordan, through delightful groves and avenues, and in a retired spot rested and took some refreshment. After that they crossed the river on a little boat. Boats of this kind lay at intervals along the shore for the accommodation of travelers who could by that means ferry themselves over. The workmen, living at different distances along the shore, saw that the boats were taken back to where they belonged. Jesus, with the disciples, did not journey close to the lake, but up toward the east to the city of Gilead. The 4 disciples with him were Parmenas of Nazareth, Saturnin, and 2 brothers, one called Tharcissus, the other Aristobulus. Tharcissus afterward became the bishop of Athens. Aristobulus later on was associated to Barnabas. I heard that with the word brother, but he was his spiritual brother only. He was a great deal with Paul and Barnabas, and I think he became a bishop of Brittany. Lazarus had brought the 2 brothers to Jesus. They were foreigners, I think Greeks, whose father had settled lately in Jerusalem. They were shipping merchants. Some of their slaves or servants, when journeying with a caravan, had gone with their beasts of burden to hear John's teaching and had been baptized by him. It was by means of these servants that their young men's parents heard of John and Jesus. Taking their sons, they went themselves to John, and both father and sons were baptized and circumcised, after which the whole family removed to Jerusalem. They were not without means, but later on, they relinquished all of their wealth in favor of the rising community of Christians. Both the young men were tall, dark-complexioned, and clever. Both had received a refined education. They were fine-looking young men, active and skillful at arranging things and making all comfortable on their journeys. Monday, August 14th, 30 A.D. We are near the end of the month of Ab 26. A little river watered the country up which Jesus was now journeying, and at a certain place he crossed it. The prophet Elijah had once been in these parts. Jesus recalled the fact and, during the whole journey, instructed the disciples in simple similitudes borrowed from various conditions of life, from the several professions, from the groves and stones and plants and places that presented themselves on the road. The disciples questioned him upon all that had happened to him in Sepphoris and Nazareth. He spoke to them of marriage in connection with the dispute he had had with the Pharisees at Sepphoris upon the question of divorce. The conjugal bond is indissoluble. Divorce was granted only by Moses in favor of a barbarous, sinful people only. The disciples questioned Jesus also upon the reproach made him by the Nazarenes, that he had no love for his neighbor, and in his own city, which ought to be nearest and dearest to him, he would work no cures. They asked if one's fellow townsmen should not be looked upon as neighbors. Then Jesus gave them a long instruction upon the love of the neighbor, proposing to them all kinds of similitudes and questions, the former of which he drew from different states of life in the world. He dwelt long upon them and pointed out place after place that rose up in the distance and said in which such or such an industry was especially pursued. He spoke, too, of those that were to follow him. They were, he said, to leave father and mother and yet obey the 4th commandment. They must treat their native city as he had done Nazareth, if so it deserved of them, and still exercise the love of the neighbor. God, their heavenly Father, and he who had been sent by him had the first claim to their love. Then he spoke of the love of the neighbor such as the world understands it, and of the publicans of Gilead, which city they were then passing, who loved those most that paid them the highest tax. He pointed afterward to Dalmanutha, which lay to the left, and said, "Those tent makers and carpet weavers love as their neighbor those that buy many tents from them, but their own poor they leave without shelter." He then borrowed a comparison from the sandal makers, which had reference to the vain curiosity of the people of Nazareth. "I have no need," he said, "of their homage, which they clothe in beautiful colors, like the variegated sandals in the workshop of the sandal makers, but which will afterward be trodden underfoot in the mud." And again, pointing to a certain city, he said, "They are like the sandal maker of that city. They slight and disparage their own children, and so the latter are forced to go abroad. But when among strangers they have learned a new style of making beautiful green sandals, their fellow citizens recall them through desire to see their work. They boast of their new-fashioned articles, which, like the glory attached to them, are soon to be trodden underfoot." Then Jesus put the question, "Suppose a traveler tears one of his sandals and go to a sandals maker's to buy a new one. Will the latter present him with the other one also?" In this way, Jesus drew comparisons from fishermen, architects, and other avocations. The disciples asked him where he intended to fix his abode. Whether he would build a house in Capernaum, he answered that he would not build upon sand, and he mentioned another city that he had to found. I could not so well understand the conversation between Jesus and the disciples when they were walking. When they were seating, I could hear better. I remember this much, however, that Jesus expressed his desire for a little boat that he might go here and there upon the lake. He wanted to teach on water as well as on land. They now went into the country of Gileaditis. Abraham and Lot had sojourned here, and even at that early period had divided the country between them. Jesus referred to that circumstance. He told the disciples also that in order to avoid scandalizing anyone, they should not speak of the lepers who had lately been cleansed. He warned them to be particularly circumspect, now to cause no excitement, for the Nazarenes would certainly stir up alarm and hatred. He told them that on the Sabbath he would again teach in Capernaum. They should then have a chance to see the love of the neighbor and the gratitude of men exemplified. For the welcome extended to him this time would be very different from that received on the occasion of the cure of the centurion's son. They may have been journeying for some hours to the northeast around the curve of the lake, when they arrived near Gilead to the south of Gamala. As in most of the cities in this district, the population was made up of pagans and Jews. The disciples were disposed to enter the city, but Jesus told them that if he went to the Jews of the place, they would neither welcome him nor give him anything. And if to the pagans, the Jews would be scandalized and would pursue him with calumny. He predicted the entire destruction of the city, saying that iniquity abounded in it. The disciples spoke of a certain Agabus, a prophet living at that time in Argob, a city of that region. For a long time, he had had numerous visions of Jesus and his doings, and had lately uttered some prophecies regarding him. Later on, Agabus joined the disciples. Jesus informed them that Agabus was a son of Herodian parents, who had reared him in the errors of their sect, but he had afterward rejected them. He called the sects beautifully covered sepulchres full of corruption. The Herodians were numerous on the west side of the Jordan in Perea, Trachonitis, and especially in Iturea. They lived very privately and had some kind of mysterious organization by which they secretly helped one another. Many poor people applied to them and received immediate relief. These Herodians were outwardly great sticklers for the prescriptions of the Pharisees. In secret, however, they aimed at freeing Judea from the Roman yoke and consequently were closely attached to Herod. They were something like the modern Freemasons. I almost wrote that note. I guess I don't have to. I understood from Jesus' words that they feigned to be very holy and magnanimous, but in reality they were hypocrites. Jesus and the disciples remained at some distance from Gilead at an inn resorted to by the publicans. Quite a number of them were gathered there at the time, to whom the pagans paid taxes on their imported goods. They did not appear to know Jesus, and he did not address them. He taught, however, of the nearness of the kingdom, of the Father who had sent his Son into the vineyard. He gave them very clearly to understand that he himself was the Son, adding that all who do his will are children of the Father. But these last words perplexed them. Jesus exhorted them to baptism. Many were converted and asked whether or not they should be baptized by John's disciples. He answered that they should wait patiently until his own disciples baptized in these parts. The disciples also asked their master today whether his baptism was different from that of John, because they had received the latter. Jesus, in his answer, made a distinction between the two, calling John's a baptism of penance, which is like confession. In Jesus' instruction to the publicans, something entered relating to the Trinity, something about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in their unity, though expressed in other terms. The disciples were not at all reserved before the publicans of this place. As Jesus went in Nazareth and had stopped with the Essenes, a circumstance that drew upon him the reproaches of the Pharisees, the disciples put questions to him concerning that sect. I heard Jesus answering in sentences expressive of praise, though interrogative in form. Mentioning various ways by which justice and fraternal love might be wounded, he asked after each, "Do the Essenes do this? Do the Essenes do that?" etc. Near Gilead, some possessed, who were running around in a desolate region outside the city, began to cry after Jesus. They were perfectly abandoned. They robbed and killed anyone that ventured within their reach and committed diverse kinds of excesses. Jesus looked back after them and gave them his blessing. They instantly ceased to rave, were freed from the evil spirit, and hurrying to him, fell at his feet. He exhorted them to penance and baptism, though bidding them wait for the latter until his disciples should go to Aenon to baptize. The country around Gilead was rocky, of a white brittle formation. Tuesday, August 15th, 30 AD. Ab the 27th. Suppose this is one of the last ordinary August 15th before the Assumption. Jesus and the disciples went from here across the mountain to the south of which lay Gamala, and took a northwesterly direction to the lake. He passed Gerasa, which, at about 1 hour's distance, lay between two ridges of the mountain. Nearby was a kind of swamp formed from a brook whose waters were dammed up, and whose only outlet into the lake was through a ravine. Jesus related to the disciples some incidents connected with this place. The people of Gerasa had once upon a time ridiculed a prophet on account of his misshapen form, whereupon he said to them, "Listen, O ye that insult my misfortune, your children shall remain obdurate, when one greater than I shall teach and heal in this place." troubled at the loss of their unclean herds, they will not rejoice at the salvation that is offered them." End quote. This was a prophecy regarding Jesus Christ and the driving of Satan into the swine. Jesus told the disciples what awaited him in Capernaum, that the Pharisees of Sepphoris, exasperated by his teaching upon divorce, had sent their emissaries to Jerusalem, that the Nazarenes had joined their complaints to theirs, and that a whole troop of Pharisees from Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Sepphoris was now dispatched to Capernaum to be on watch for him and to dispute against him. Just at this moment, they encountered several immense caravans of pagans with mules and oxen. The latter had great thick jaws, broad, heavy horns, and went along with lowered head. It was a trading caravan going from Syria into Egypt. They had come into the country of Gerasa, partly in ships and partly over the bridge of the Jordan higher up. There were many among them who had joined the caravan for the purpose of hearing the prophet. A company waited upon Jesus to know whether the prophet would teach in Capernaum. But he told them that they should not now go to Capernaum, but encamp on the declivity of the mountain to the north of Gerasa, whither the prophet would go soon. There was something in Jesus' tone and manner that made them respond, "Master, thou too art a prophet." And his glance roused in them the doubt as to whether he might not himself be the one for whom they were in search. When Jesus entered the inn outside Gerasa with his disciples there to lodge, the crowd of pagans and travelers was so great that he left at once. But the disciples stayed with the pagans, talking to them of the prophet and instructing them. Gerasa lay on the declivity of a valley about an hour and a half from the lake. It was larger and cleaner than Capernaum, and, like almost all the cities of these parts, it had a mixed population of pagan and Jews. The former had their own temples. The latter formed the poor and oppressed portion of the inhabitants, although they had their synagogue and rabbi. There was much business carried on, and the trades were numerous, for the caravans from Syria and Asia passed through Gerasa going down into Egypt. I saw before the city gate a long building, 7.5 minutes in length, wherein were manufactured long iron bars and pipes. They forged the bars flat, and then soldered them together into a circular form. Leaden pipes were also made. The furnaces at which they worked were not fed with wood, but with some kind of black mass dug out of the earth. Almost sounds like coal, but anyways, the iron they used came from Argob. The pagans of the caravans had encamped to the north of Gerasa and on the southern side of the rising mountain. To the same place some pagans belonging to the city had come, also some Jews, but these latter stood apart by themselves. The pagans were differently clad from the Jews, their tunics reaching only halfway down the lower limbs. Some of them must have been rich, for I saw women who had their hair so braided with pearls as to form a perfect cap. Some wore it on the top of their head above their veil, braided with pearls into a little basket. Wednesday, August 16th. Jesus ascended the mountainside where, walking about, he taught the crowds. He went among them, here and there, and at times he stood still, keeping up a kind of conversation with the travelers. He addressed them with questions, which he answered himself in words full of instruction. He asked, for instance, "Whence are ye? What impelled you to take this journey? What do ye expect from the prophet?" And he taught them what they must become in order to share in salvation. He said, "Blessed are they that have journeyed so long and so toilsome a way to seek salvation, but woe to them among whom it arises and who will not receive it." He explained the prophecy of the Messiah, the call of the Gentiles, told of the three kings of whom those people knew, and also of their expedition in obedience to it. In the caravan were some people from that country and city where the envoy of Abgar of Edessa had stayed overnight near the brick kilns on his return journey with Jesus' picture and letter. Jesus did not cure any sick here. And I'll just set an aside, the envoy of Abgar, that had to do with drawing Jesus, and Jesus kind of gave him a drawing of himself. So anyways, the strangers were for the most part well disposed, but there were some among them who regretted having undertaken such a journey. They had expected to hear something very different from the prophet's words, something more flattering to the senses. After these instructions, into which Jesus introduced many similitudes, he went with his 4 disciples to dine with a Jewish doctor of the law, a Pharisee who dwelt outside the city. He had invited Jesus to be his guest, though his pride prevented his appearance at the instruction given the Gentiles. There were present at table some other Pharisees from the city. They received Jesus in a friendly manner, which, however, was only feigned, for they were hypocrites. A circumstance occurred during the course of the meal that gave Jesus a suitable opportunity for telling them the truth. A pagan slave or servant laid upon the table a beautiful dish of many colors, filled with confectionery made of spices kneaded together in a shape of birds and flowers. One of the guests raised the alarm. There was, he said, something unclean on the dish, and he pushed the poor slave back, calling him opprobrious names, and put him last among the other servants. Jesus interposed, "Not the dish, but what is in it is full of uncleanness." The master of the house replied, "Thou mistakest, those sweet meats are perfectly clean and very costly." Jesus responded in words like these, "They are truly unclean. They are nothing else than sensual pleasures made of the sweat, the blood, the marrow, and the tears of widows, orphans, and the poor." Unquote. And he read them a severe lesson upon their manner of acting, their prodigality, their covetousness, and their hypocrisy. I have a problem with hyphenated words. That was a hyphenated word. Anyways, they grew wrathful, but could make no reply. They quitted the house, leaving Jesus alone with the host. The latter was very smooth and affable toward Jesus, but it was all hypocrisy. He was hoping in this way to entrap him and get something at last to report against him to the committee at Capernaum. Toward evening, Jesus again taught the pagans on the mountain. When they asked him whether they should be baptized by John and expressed a wish to settle in Palestine, Jesus counseled them to put off their baptism until better instructed. He told them, moreover, to go first of all across the Jordan to Upper Galilee into the region of Adama, where they would find good people and pagans already instructed, and where he himself would again teach. It was dark, and Jesus taught by torchlight. The instruction over, he left his hearers and went to the shore of the lake and down to the spot where Peter's men were waiting for him with a boat. It was late. The 3 sailors made use of lights when they disembarked about half an hour below Bethsaida Julius. Peter and Andrew, with the help of their servants, had built, especially for his use, the little boat in which Jesus had crossed. They were not only mariners and fishermen, but shipbuilders also. Peter owned 3 vessels, one of them very large, as long as a house. Jesus' little boat held about 10 men. It was oval in form, almost like an egg. The forepart and the stern were enclosed places for storing and affording accommodations for washing the feet. In the center rose the mast with poles extended from it to the sides of the vessel for support. Above and around those poles swung the sails. The seats were ranged around the mast. Jesus often taught from this little boat, which he used likewise to cross from point to point to sail about among the other ships. The large vessels had around the lower part of the mast decks formed like terraces or galleries, one above the other. They were supported by posts placed at regular intervals so that a view could be had through them from side to side. They were furnished with canvas curtains that could be drawn as to form separate compartments like little cells. The poles supporting the masts had projecting rounds to facilitate climbing, and on either side of the vessel were floating chests or barrels like wigs or fins to prevent its being overturned in a storm. Floaters, yeah. They could be filled with water or emptied according as it was necessary for the ship to ride more lightly or sink to a greater depth, i.e. anchor itself. The ship caught was sometimes preserved in them. At either end of the vessel were movable planks, which on being shoved out facilitated access to the casks, to neighboring boats, and to the nets. When not in use for fishing purposes, the vessels were held in readiness to transport caravans and travelers across the lake. The sailors and servants of the fishermen were, for the most part, pagan slaves. Peter owned some. And that is finally the end of this reading. Okay, so I have extensive notes because there was a powerful theme about lepers, but I'll get to that. So first of all, when doing these things, and this is a personal note, I have to adjust my rhetoric so that readers can understand as much as possible. And I know, because when I'm reading and I lose myself in the reading, I know I'm not understanding it, and they're not going to either. That means I have to sometimes I keep my reading errors in there and my little elaborations because I want you to feel like you're reading this with me. If I just spat out the words like a text-to-speech AI, it may it'll sound more flawless. And I used to drive myself nuts by, crap, I said something wrong, so I got to stop it and re-record that part. And like I said, I was driving myself nuts with it. And it would cause me so much frustration to the point that I almost didn't want to do this anymore. But I want to keep doing this because of my education in literature, my ability to read between the lines, my ability to connect concepts. It's probably something I should be doing, so I am doing it. Anyways, when it's too flawless, it gets less human. Now, the study of rhetoric has been a challenging one for me, but I've studied it basically my entire adult life because of my experience trying to write novels and music. So, it's a tough thing to balance, but these aren't songs. So, if there's an error or a reading error, you only listen to it once anyway. Maybe you listen to it twice. You don't sit there listening to it over and over again. So, I guess you'll have to just bear with me. Next note. We met two other disciples with Greek names, and that's what stuck out to me. In John 12, I think, I'm pretty sure it's John 12 or John 13, I think it's John 12, he gets visited by the Greeks, and Philip brings us to him, and he says to Philip that this is an important event. And he said to him, this is where he made the line, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it just remains a single grain. So we learned one of these two disciples had gone to Athens, and the other one was associated with Barnabas, who was Paul's buddy, and eventually went to Brittany, all the way to France. So I guess he was Bishop of Brittany. All right. So now the major part. Over a decade ago, when reading this text, I examined the styles in which Jesus healed people. Like, why does he spit into his hand and rub his spit in people's eye? Like, that obviously, it's a little bit weird, so you study it. What does it mean? There's a alliterative thing you have to get from it. not just look at it and it's like, oh, I guess that was a healing method back in the day. It wasn't. There's something symbolic about it. So, and this is why he uses similitudes, because there's a similitude in his healing. Now, I knew this long ago. It expresses in the realm of flesh and spirit. And I already had this knowledge. Our soul's ailments are connected to our flesh's ailments. So if you suffer from anger issues, well, you have an unsettling part of your soul. You have a vice that you're practicing that's attracting you to become angry. And I deal with anger a lot. So anyways, what I'd studied, when Jesus healed lepers, he always told them to go to priests, because priests were the gateways to their society. That is, shepherds are the gateway to the flock. They decide who is and isn't in the flock. And this is why priests can excommunicate. So this meant that lepers were outside, even though they were Jewish by, name. So there's a lot of people who say they're Catholic, but they don't go to Mass and don't submit themselves to any priest. So they were given the instruction, go first to the priest, which is like, do things correctly this time. Because perhaps they were trying to assert themselves into the flock without going to the priest, which is kind of what Protestants do. They're their own priests. They just have quote-unquote ministers who are just people who make orations. So this is the purity of Catholicism. If you're an obedient person, you submit yourself to the sacraments and to the priest. Though we may have some very bad priests. Unfortunately, they're still consecrated. This is what makes them so bad. And those priests house you and administer the sacraments to you. Lepers, because they received this instruction, were not going to the priests, so this was their repair. Lepers are like disobedient children who submit to no one but themselves, but then it's like their whole body begins to degenerate because they are like disconnected appendages that rot. They're disconnected from the heart. They're disconnected from the liver, the kidneys, which clean the blood. An appendage, and the liver and the kidneys, we could see as sacraments. See how this goes. An appendage receives blood and gives blood back, but a leprous appendage would give tainted blood back. That is his disobedience. It would overload the liver and the kidneys. So he had to be cut off from society, and such was justice. Leviticus 13 and 14 talked about how to deal with them. So it was very much a thing in their society. Now these days we don't much deal with leprosy because modern medicine has dealt with it pretty well, but it still manifests itself in different ways. But it makes me think, next note, of that iconic figure, King Baldwin. Remember if he had a number attached to him, but anyways. He was the young leprous king of Jerusalem. We saw him featured in the movie The Kingdom of Heaven. Now, the question is, why did he have leprosy? We can give the physical reasons, but I'm concerned with the spiritual reasons. Was he so afflicted? Why was he so afflicted? So we might ask the question, was he a victim soul? Did he represent the city of Jerusalem or the Holy Land in a figurative way? Was this God saying that it didn't do to crusade to a land surrounded by vipers? Was Jerusalem never supposed to be Christian until a particular event occurred? We do not know. Was Jerusalem the cursed fig tree that we weren't to touch? So a strong theme prevails here. Jesus talks about the concept of neighbor and how the world understands neighbor is you treat nicely those who profit you and you distance yourself from those that don't, which is not neighborly, but the love of mammon, which my church just went over this week in the gospel reading, which was the rich man and Lazarus, the poor leprous man outside the rich man's gate who went to Abraham's bosom. Now, the rich man was the true leper in this case. And we think of Revelation 3. I'm actually going to look this up quickly because it's a very resounding statement, like a very resonant one. So we'll go to Revelation 3. It's near the end. Behold, it's Revelation 3:17. Behold, thou sayest, I am rich and made wealthy, and have need of nothing, and knowest not that thou art wretched, miserable, and poor, and blind, and naked. I love that verse. Because those people who chase mammon around, they neglect their souls. Their souls are poor and neglected. They're leprous in state. They don't go to the sacraments. They don't go to church. They don't go to mass. So they're just sort of cut off. They cut themselves off from God. So I'm finding my spot here. They cut themselves off from God in the pursuit of mammon, and we can't consider people who pursue mammon as our neighbors because they have cut themselves off from God in the first place. And this is something we have to study. So, my next note. So this makes me think of high-profile conversions to the Catholic faith. Now I think of Milo Yiannopoulos. He didn't just convert to Catholicism, but remained in his gay lifestyle. He rejected the gay, or he's trying to. He's making a concerted effort to, and what that effort he's putting into it is what empowers him to do so. Now, I've been following Milo Yiannopoulos for about a decade now. He's a very interesting character because of this. He's attached to Catholicism, especially traditional Catholicism, but he still kind of acts in that fiery-tongued manner online. So it's something I think he himself is struggling with. How to express a loving persona, because he's very whip smart, he's very witty, but he lashes out. And his scourging of other people, verbal scourging, is often very un-Christ-like. Now, it's Christ-like to call Pharisees a brood of vipers, but sometimes he goes overboard. So he's an interesting case. But him, I feel, is a genuine conversion because he's trying to change himself. But I don't think he's fully there yet. But we contrast this with other high-profile conversions. So the father is right to be excited about the prodigal son's conversion, right? Because it's his son. But it doesn't mean the whole neighborhood should have to be like, well, we'll rejoice with the father for the father's sake and hope for the son, but we're going to stay guarded about it. And this is what he went over this. We have to be circumspect. That's the word he used, or she used. Now, this past year, or 2 years ago, I don't remember, we heard of a woman who made something like $9 million from an unjust profession. Let's just leave it at that. And she supposedly converted to Christianity. And people were like, look, we won someone high profile over. And it's like they were rejoicing. But the truth is, you have to be circumspect about that. When we hear of powerful conversions in this text, or that is Anne Catherine's, and in the Bible, they would surrender much of their wealth to the cause. But we have the Ananias and Sapphira example, I think of Acts 5, we have to be wary of. Some people chase epiphanies because they love having epiphanies rather than what the knowledge would entail. They're attention whores, as we might call them. The leprous have to do the opposite. They can't draw attention to themselves. They kind of have to avoid it. Maybe that is why they were leprous in the first place. They were trying to draw too much attention. They loved attention. And so God cut them off from attention because that attention whoring was plaguing their souls. So they have to abstain and fast from attention and allow themselves to integrate silently so as to not cause scandal. St. Paul When he converted, he banished himself to Syria, which was Arabia back then, for something like 3 years because he was like a leper returned. He had to go show himself to the priest, and he had to go withdraw himself until he was fully ready to go back and be integrated into society. So, let's go to the next note. That was the major theme. Now I've found some other minor themes, so this will be brief. We have a revolving door moment where Jesus went to a place, saw the pagans, and just left. And if we remember, he said in the gospel example, he said to the Syrophoenician woman, I came for the children of Israel. I don't give the food meant for the children. I don't give it to the dogs instead. So she said, well, yeah, but as dogs, we still accept the crumbs that fall from the children's tables. So it's like, okay, well, he healed her. He showed her that mercy. And he didn't heal her, he healed her daughter. So maybe that's why he left. This wasn't his fight. And this is a virtue of diligence. We tend to do battle in everything, and it wears us out. And Jesus even has perfect constitution, but he's still not going to take fights that aren't his. So that's probably why he left when he saw the pagans, although he did extend his mercies and miracles towards them. And we saw this with when Mary and Joseph traveled to Egypt when he was a baby. So his disciples did engage with them. And we saw that in John 13, the early example, when Philip said, hey, the Greeks have come to see you. So his disciples engaged with them, but they were getting practice. That was their fight. So that's probably why Jesus left that to his apostles. Second to last note, we see here the principle of sentiment. He made a statement, a contrasting statement, blessed are those who came long distance to see me, but woe are those who, I upsprang in their midst and they didn't have to work a lot to see me. And this is the principle of sentiment. The harder you work for something, the more pain it causes you, the more you tend to love and treasure it. Which is why women are supposed to bear their children in pain. It creates a love for those children. Last note, there are a lot of modernists, and I'm talking about the last statement where Peter owned slaves. There are a lot of modernists who gasp at the concept of owning slaves, but biblically, slaves, and we have to understand this linguistically, slaves are either people enslaved or people who were employed. We use the word employed now to distinguish the two, but they didn't have those words back then. Employed is such a corporate word anyway. And people in corporations, they're famously more enslaved than even the slaves were back then. So that's that. Ave Maria.